I have the great pleasure to introduce the talk of my dear Jean-Baptiste. Jean-Baptiste Guillon is assistant researcher here at the Collège, and he has received his PhD at the University of Nantes, thanks to the wonderful supervision of Professor Michon, right, who is one of the main introducers of the problematic of free will in France. And I'm all the more happy to present Jean-Baptiste that, you know, the Collège de France is a special institution where we have chairs in physics, biology, archaeology, mathematics, and all our chairs have the opportunity to have every 2 years a researcher assistant. And there is every year a very competitive, very high competition among the researchers, because we have a famous prize which is called the prize of the Fondation Hugo du Collège de France. And I'm very happy and proud to say that Jean-Baptiste received this year the prize of the Fondation Hugo du Collège de France for his work, which is an outstanding recompense. So I think we should congratulate him for that. Okay, so precisely in his important dissertation, Jean-Baptiste used the resources of anti-skeptical and common sense epistemology in order to defend a Cartesian view that we know the existence of libertarian free will on the ground of our common experience of free will. He has published already, despite his young age, papers on free will, on skepticism in prestigious journals as Synthèse or Philosophical Studies. So it's my great pleasure now to give him the floor for his talk on the epistemology of agent-causation.
Thank you very much for this introduction. So the problem I'm going to address in this paper, I'm going to address one objection against libertarianism, which is the epistemological objection, and I want to separate it from other objections. So in this presentation, I will not discuss the compatibility problem. I believe that we have very good arguments that have been now given to settle, or at least to make a good case for incompatibilism about this question, which these arguments make at least reasonable, make it reasonable to believe that free will and determinism are incompatible. And I'm not going to deal with the intelligibility problem in Keynes' sense. So I will assume that the intelligibility problem has been at least reasonably dealt with by some models of libertarian free will, like Robert Keynes' model or like Tim O'Connor's model. So I will assume that these problems have been dealt with, at least reasonably so. And the problem I want to focus on is the epistemological challenge, which I have written on the handout. So assuming that some complex model of indeterministic free will is possible, for example, Tim O'Connor's model, how could anyone claim to presently know that one such possible model is actually realized? So how could our experience of free will provide us with that kind of information? So this challenge is not a completely new one. So it appeared prominently in the debate between Descartes and Spinoza, for instance, or between Hume and Reid at another time of history of philosophy. And but in contemporary analytic philosophy, it has been dealt with usually at the end of papers or in footnotes or in various sections in 1 or 2 pages, but I don't know of any work that focuses directly on the problem of the epistemology of libertarianism. So and even though I think it hasn't been properly addressed, I think there is a few mentions of the challenge itself. For example, in John Fisher's formulation, his quote, "A libertarian, it seems, must claim that he knows from his armchair that causal determinism is false, but how could we know in advance such an empirical thesis?" And interestingly, we can find the same condemnation of the experience of free will in the writings of libertarian authors as well, not only compatibilists like Fisher. So, for instance, Van Inwagen, some philosophers believe that it's possible to find out whether we have free will by introspection, but this seems just obviously wrong. So, and then he gives an argument. And Robert Caine, even Robert Caine, one might say, the existence question for free will cannot be finally settled by armchair speculation, but only by future empirical inquiry. What philosophers can do with regard to the existence question is to suggest models about how free will might work in the brain so that future researchers have some idea of what to look for when they search for it. So the claim I'm going to defend against this problem is the libertarian experiential knowledge claim. So it's the view that the common belief in free will, as grounded in our common first-person experiences of being free, can constitute reliable knowledge, even if that experience has indeterminate purport. And in order to focus on the epistemological problem, and I will have to make a few assumptions in the introduction regarding other disputed questions. So it's important to note that the four assumptions I'm going to make here are not assumptions that are necessary for my solution to work. They are necessary for the problem to be raised, or for the problem at least to be clearly distinguished from other problems. So it's not really commitments that I have, it's commitments in order for the problem to be clearly raised. So even though I make this point because obviously the assumptions I'm going to make are highly disputed and controversial, but it's just to explain to you why I'm making them. So the first assumption is the experiential ground, that our common notion and conviction of free will is grounded in our common first-person experience as of acting freely. It's not grounded in other consideration and morality or anything like that. It's grounded in our experience. It's not either grounded on an inference, any kind of inference. Second assumption, incompatibilism. The content of our common experience of free will is incompatible with determinism. Third assumption, the intelligibility thesis. The content of our common experience of free will, as incompatibilist, is intelligible and compatible with whatever knowledge we have from current science. So here I mean that it is both logically possible in itself, this content, libertarian content, and that it is conceivable given our best scientific knowledge of human beings. So models like agent-causation or Robert Caine's event-causationist model are supposed to establish this point of intelligibility. And finally, I will have to assume that skepticism about perception is false. So this is the anti-skepticism assumption. Our perceptual beliefs, as grounded in perceptual experiences, constitute knowledge, at least typically so. Why should we make this assumption? Well, because an epistemological objection to libertarianism would obviously be too strong and irrelevant if it leads to skepticism about perception as well. Typically, a skeptic about free will doesn't want to be committed to general skepticism. So we have to assume that skeptical arguments against perception fail and see what follows about skepticism about free will. So here is the program, a very long program, I'm afraid. In the first part, I'm going to present some epistemological consideration about the epistemological situation of the question, and in the second part, I will try to give an epistemological model for one kind of libertarianism, namely agent-causation. So let me start with the important epistemological thesis I'm relying on. The first important building block of my epistemology is the thesis JPF, that our common experience of free will gives prima facie justification for the thesis that we do have free will. And if we assume that our experience of free will is incompatibilist, we can move to JPF star, that our common experience of free will gives prima facie justification for libertarianism. What is the motivation for this claim? Well, the motivation is a comparison with perception. If we want to avoid a regress of justifications, we have to stop somewhere in the regress of justification of reasons. And many foundationalist epistemologists will say that the way to stop, for example, in perception, is to say that some beliefs are justified not by other beliefs, but justified by the perceptual experiences themselves. For example, my visual experience as of a blue chair in front of me gives me justification to believe that there is a blue chair in front of me. In the same way, my experience as of being free gives me prima facie justification that I am free. So the important point, it's very important to notice here that this claim is in fact a very modest claim once you've noticed that it's only prima facie justification that is claimed to be had and not ultima facie justification. Prima facie justification means that it's defeasible, and in particular it could be defeated in two different ways that epistemologists call rebutting defeaters and undermining defeaters. So it might be defeated by a definite proof that, for example, determinism is the case. If we had a scientific proof that neurological determinism is the case, for example, then we would have a rebutting defeater against our experience of libertarianism. Now, I think I have assumed in introduction that this is not the case, so I think the only issue we have to deal with is undermining defeaters. An undermining defeater is a defeater according to which the experience you have will not be a good, will not be a reliable indicator of the truth of the content. It's not an indication that the content is false. It's an indication about the reliability of the experience. So, do we have an indication that our experience of free will is unreliable? Well, one might think that there is a clear argument that our experience of free will is unreliable. That's the traditional argument from Leibniz and Spinoza, that our experience of free will is fallible. It's, for example, Spinoza says, a falling stone might have the experience of free will, therefore the experience of free will is fallible. Well, what should we think of that proof that the experience is unreliable? This proof presupposes that epistemic reliability equals infallibility. Well, if you have this thesis that reliability means infallibility, then of course you're going to say that our visual experiences, our perceptual experiences are unreliable as well. So you're going to arrive at general skepticism. We don't want that. So we have to accept with most epistemologists today that fallibilism is true, that epistemic reliability is not infallibility. Reliability is compatible with fallibility. So noticing that our experience of free will is fallible is not a real challenge against the reliability of the experience. On the other hand, noticing that the experience could be fallible without any problem is not sufficient to settle whether it is reliable, because we still have to make the point that it is positively reliable, even if reliability does not mean infallibility. So that's the claim I'm turning to now. Is it the case that our experience of free will is reliable in a weaker sense than infallibility? And what could be our reason to believe that our experience of free will is reliable? This is the second section. I think ultimately our reason to believe that our experience is reliable comes from common sense considerations, and I think we don't have any other, not only any better, but any other reason to assume that. But I think it's a sufficient and good reason. So here is the second important claim of my epistemology. We are prima facie justified to presume that our experience of free will is epistemically reliable, so is a reliable indicator of the truth of libertarianism, because it is a common sense experience. And this thesis about libertarianism comes from a more general thesis, which is the common sense thesis CS on your handout, that in order to avoid skepticism, it is necessary to accept that we are prima facie justified to presume the reliability of the experiences delivered by common sense faculties. Why should we do that? Well, think of the criterion skeptical argument. The criterion challenge against perception is the challenge to come up with a reason to believe that our sight, for example, is reliable. What could we say in order to justify the claim that sight is reliable? One might be tempted to say, well, we know that sight is reliable because we know that light rays bump on the objects and then come into our retina and cause some neural processes. But of course, ancient Greeks in the 4th century BC did not know about that. And presumably they were not they were not forced to be skeptics, so they had a reason to consider sight as reliable, even in the absence of this kind of evidence. And what were their reasons to believe that sight was reliable? Well, I think the only reason they had, and the very good reason they had, is that their experiences were common sense experiences. What do I mean by that? Well, common sense is a very vague notion. It can mean quite a number of different things, but what I mean is probably the following three conditions: that these experiences, perceptual experiences, but also the experience of free will, are first intuitively strong, and probably stronger than all or most philosophical arguments potentially raised against them. Second, I think we can easily argue that they are natural, in the sense that they are produced by all or most well-functioning adult human beings in their normal habitat. And third, I think we can argue also that these experiences, perceptual and experience of free will, are normally accompanied by a second-order conviction that these experiences themselves are reliable. So for free will, the most famous quote about free will, it seems to me, expresses this second-order intuition when Dr. Johnson famously said, "Sir, we know our will is free." This is the expression of an intuition of knowledge, not just of free will, but of knowledge of free will. So so I claim that we have prima facie common sense justification to assume the reliability of our libertarian experience. Again, I think it's important to notice that this claim is a modest claim because it's just about prima facie justification, and it's open to any kind of defeater that one might want to bring into the picture in order to say, well, no, it's not justified ultimately. I'm completely open to this at that point. We'll see defeaters afterwards, but at least the fact that our experience of libertarian free will is common sense gives us prima facie reason to consider it as reliable. Now, the question is, of course, is this prima facie justification defeated? Do we have further reasons to think that, in fact, our experience of free will is not reliable? There might here again come two different kinds of defeaters. So there might come some empirical defeaters, for example, from psychology or neuroscience, the work of Libet or Wegener, for example, that our experience of free will is completely decorrelated from the events, from the fact of actions. So I will leave these issues aside. I think that these kind of worries have been adequately dealt with by many philosophers, Al-Mili, for example. So I will assume that these worries are satisfactorily dealt with outside of this talk. What I will focus on is the second kind of defeater, not an empirical defeater, but a philosophical defeater, according to which it's impossible for our experience of free will to be a reliable detector of the fact of libertarianism. So this is the kind of intuition that Fisher has when he said in the quote I have put again on the handout, a libertarian, it seems, must claim that he knows from his armchair that causal determinism is false, but how could he know in advance such an empirical thesis? So it's the claim that our experience of free will is not the right kind of source in order to give knowledge of this kind of fact. And so we can give a more precise formulation of this intuition as the claim non-R, which is non-reliability. The challenge is that, apparently at least, the macrophysical fact, so the neurologically realized fact of our experience of free will, couldn't possibly be reliably correlated to the minute microphysical facts of indeterminism. So there seems to be a lack of correlation here, and therefore a kind of epistemic lock. And this has led Fisher to what he calls his held hostage thesis, which is that if our experience of free will has libertarian purport, then our prima facie justification to consider it as a reliable source of information is ultima facie defeated by the philosophical consideration that such an experience couldn't possibly reliably depend on some minute facts of fundamental physics. And therefore, our conception of ourselves as free would be held hostage to the future deliverances of fundamental physics. Okay, so I think there are three possible reactions to this held hostage challenge. One reaction is to accept the conclusion, to say, okay, therefore, we have to bite the bullet and say that we don't know yet whether we're free or not. That's basically Balaguer's solution. He accepts a libertarian conception of free will, but he says that it's an open scientific problem that future neuroscience or whatever will tell us about. The second reaction is to revise one's conception of free will in order to avoid this conclusion. And this is what I called Fisher's second thought compatibilism. So as a first thought, maybe Fisher would have accepted that on the face of it, our experience seems incompatibilist, but when you notice that the incompatibilist purport would deprive you of the possibility to know about free will, then you may retract your initial incompatibilism and say, okay, no, in fact, I'm moving to a more modest meaning of free will, a compatibilist meaning of free will. This is very close to the kind of argument that Patrick Todd discussed yesterday. And the third reaction, which I call Epicurean epistemology, is to say that despite appearances, the common experience of free will can be a reliable indicator of its content, of its libertarian content, even if this content has libertarian purport. So how could it be that, this is of course the view I'm going to defend, that we can have a reliable indication of libertarianism from our experience. But in order to do that, I think we have to tackle the impossibility challenge. We have to tackle the claim that it's impossible, philosophically, for some philosophical reason, impossible for the experience of free will to track the fact or to depend on the fact of indeterminism. How does one tackle an impossibility claim? Well, by trying to give a model. So that's why I'm going to try to give a model of reliability of the experience of free will. And this could be done for, that's what I call an epistemological model of free will, of libertarian free will. And an epistemological model, the role of an epistemological model is to show a reliable dependence between the experience that gives knowledge and the fact that is known. And of course, this means that part of this model would be a model about what the fact of libertarianism is. And given that there are different facts, different accounts of the fact of libertarian free will, agent causal, even causal, there will be accordingly different models of the reliable dependence. Now, personally, I am neutral between even causal and agent causal libertarianism, and that's why I'm interested in giving epistemological models both for both kinds of libertarianisms. But I have tried to give a model for even causal libertarianism elsewhere in another paper, and today I'm going to focus on the model for agent causal libertarianism. So the first part is to have a model of free will. The second part is to have an understanding of what reliability is for the experience. And the notion of reliability, here again, I will draw from considerations, from epistemological considerations about skepticism, in the skeptical literature, in the literature about skepticism. So, for example, one might have the following proposal for what reliability is. We've seen that it cannot be infallibility, but here is another bad proposal. I call it the tracking of consequences. So here is the view. An experience is a reliable indicator of the truth of its content only if it tracks the truth of any of its logical consequences, by which I mean the propositions it logically entails. So why I think a little reflection on the skepticism literature is enough to understand that this constraint does lead to skepticism as well. Why? Because it's clear that my experience as of having hands has the logical consequence that I'm not a pure soul manipulated by an evil demon, according to Descartes' scenario. So and secondly, it is also evident that my experience as of having hands does not track the truth of the fact that I'm not manipulated by an evil demon. So my experience as of having hands does not satisfy the constraint of tracking the consequences, tracking its consequences. So it's clear that what is meant by tracking is a counterfactual dependence, and it's clear that there is no counterfactual dependence between my experience as of having hands and the fact that I'm not manipulated. So this is the claim star on the handout. If I were deceived by an evil demon, I would still have the experience as of having hands. So there is no tracking here. Now, what is false about the logical implications or the logical consequences of my experience is not true about the proper content of my experience. The proper content of my experience is I have hands. And this proper content is tracked by the fact of my experience. So we have two counterfactual dependencies noted as 1 and 2. If I didn't have hands, I would not have the experience as of having hands. And if I had hands in close counterfactual situations, I would still have the experience as of having hands. So here we have a tracking that epistemologists are happy about, but it's important to notice that it's a tracking only for the proper content of the experience, not for its logical consequences. Does it mean that we don't need any kind of reliability for the logical consequences? Well, not necessarily so, because there is another account of reliability which is not tracking, but which is called safety. What is safety? Well, safety is the claim that a certain proposition or certain experience couldn't easily have been false. Or in other words, so the claim that I'm not manipulated by an evil demon is a claim that couldn't easily have been false. You have to go to very far off possibilities in order to make it true. So you have to, in terms of possible worlds, it's only in far off possible worlds that this claim is true. Given that this possibility is a very far off one, you can say that in the close or nearby possible worlds, your experience as of having held is safe relative to the possibility of being manipulated. So this is the claim 3. In most nearby possible worlds, I am not a pure soul deceived by an evil demon. So we can have tracking for the proper content of the experiences, and we can have safety for the logical consequences. So these are the two and the only two constraints that I will put on my model of reliability for agent causation as well. I will try to show that our experience of free will, libertarian free will, can be tracking its proper content and can be safe relative to its logical consequences. So let's turn now to the let's try to show how it works and whether it's really possible to satisfy these constraints now that we know the program or the desiderata that we have to satisfy. So as I've said, an epistemological model has to start with the first part, which is a model of the fact itself that has to be reliably known. So here is a short description of what I take to be the metaphysical fact of free will according to the libertarian agent-causal model. So the human body or the human brain is a complex macroscopic substance such that when its microscopic components reach a certain level and a certain appropriate kind of organizational complexity, an emergent, non-structural macroscopic property appears, namely a top-down active causal power, which is a power of the agent himself. This power of the agent has a certain probability structure, which means that the reasons present to the agent's mind dispose him to cause action A1 with probability P1, action A2 with probability P2, etc. And these probabilities are, or can sometimes be, less than 1, so that the actual exercise of this active power is not predetermined. Okay, so now that we have a model of the fact that we want to reliably know, how could we have tracking of this content and safety for the consequences? So I'm going to skip, I think, the first section in which I was I could have made a small short comparison between the prospects, the kind of problems that are raised for the even causalist and for the agent causalist. I think that there is a problem that the even causalist has that the agent causalist doesn't have. And on the other hand, the problem that the agent causalist has is not really the one that the even causalist is worried about. But I will skip that and focus only on the problems that the agent causalist has in order to claim a kind of reliability between perception and experience. Between experience and fact, sorry. So I think there is one general problem, and then, which is section 2, the Humean problem, and then somehow a much narrower version of this problem, which is more worrisome. So this will be section 3. The first problem, the first challenge that an agent causalist has when he wants to claim that we have reliable knowledge of agent causation is that he's trying to claim that we somehow, in some sense of perception, that we perceive causation, that we perceive agent causation. But is it not directly in contradiction to Hume's famous veto that any perception of causation is impossible? So there is this huge tradition of Humeanism which deems this kind of perception totally impossible because it's perception of causation. Well, against this Humean veto, there is one response, which is inspired in part by what Tim O'Connor says in his paragraph, in his section on the epistemological problem. So the unimpressed response is to say, well, this Humean veto would undermine not only the knowledge of agent causation, but the knowledge of any kind of causation, even causation, and even the knowledge of regular, of common, scientifically respectable kinds of causation. So this is clearly a very strong form of skepticism against the possibility to know any kind of causation. And secondly, we know that there is an impressive list of metaphysicians who have now refused, and at least from even from the time of Hume himself, there is a long tradition of metaphysicians who have refused, and with good arguments, this veto, and who have and its strong skeptical consequences. So we can give this impressive list of authors, starting with John Locke, Thomas Reid, William James, Whitehead, Dukas, Anscombe, Harry and Madden, even Fales, Nancy Cartwright, David Armstrong, David Lewis, Helen Beebe, Mumford Hanium, and also Professor Tiercelin. All these authors claim that it's possible to have knowledge, perception of facts of causation. So probably we shouldn't be too much worried about Hume's veto. There are good accounts out there of the possibility to perceive causation. And this is to the point that Helen Beebe has declared in an important paper, that chapter, that Hume's argument from a contemporary perspective is not at all persuasive. So we shouldn't be worried about the Humean veto. Well, I think this unimpressed response is partly fine, but partly too easy. One reason why it's partly too easy is that in this list of authors, the kind of causation that is claimed to be perceivable there are very different kinds of causations. For example, there are also some authors who claim that it's possible and argue that it's possible to have knowledge of perception of a regularist kind of causation, but not of a singularist kind of causation. So this is the case for David Lewis or Helen Beebe. And second, you have authors who claim that it's possible to have knowledge of a singularist kind of causation, but not of a neo-Aristotelian kind of causation. This is the case for Armstrong and Fales. So this again will not be satisfying for the agent causalist's purpose. Third, there are authors who grant the possibility of neo-Aristotelian perception for neo-Aristotelian causation, but not for agent causal causation. And fourth, there are some authors who accept the possibility to perceive agent causation, but not indeterministic agent causation, only compatibilist agent causation. So these authors, again, will not help for our purposes. And finally, what we really need in order to have a satisfactory epistemological model is an author who defends a kind of the perception for a kind of causation that is singularist, neo-Aristotelian, agent causation, indeterministic agent causation. And in the whole list I have given of authors who defend the possibility of perception of causation, I know of only one author who has given such a model. It's Thomas Reid. And so I don't think we can be too happy with this impressive list of anti-Humean epistemology, so to speak, because, well, there is only one guy in this list who can really help us all the way down to what we need for an epistemology of libertarian agent causation. So, okay, so I think, in fact, the reason why I said that the response is partly satisfying is that it is true that in this list of authors, we find good responses to Hume's objections, properly speaking. And I think that the agent causationist can avail himself of the responses to Hume's worries, even if they are given by authors who defend another kind of causation. But so I will skip on the detail on Hume's worry. I'm referring you to Helen Beebe's fantastic chapter on that in order to see why Hume's worries are not really. We shouldn't be too much concerned about them. But the problem is that there is another worry which is not formulated by Hume himself and which is against indeterministic agent causation, properly speaking, as opposed to the other kinds of causations. Against the perception of indeterministic agent causation as opposed to the perception of other kinds of causation. So Hume himself does not formulate this problem. Interestingly, the first author who formulates the proper problem for indeterministic agent causation, as far as I'm aware, is Thomas Reid himself. So Thomas Reid is aware of a problem that Hume apparently isn't aware of for his own view, and he gives a response to this problem. I will not follow his response because I think it has important problems, but the problem that Reid raises could be called the problem of perceiving the inactual. So Reid puts it this way: power is not an object of consciousness. That we are not conscious of it will be evident if we reflect that consciousness is that power of the mind by which it has an immediate knowledge of its own operation. Power is not an operation of the mind. Every operation of the mind is the exertion of some power of the mind, but we are conscious of the operation only. The power itself lies behind the scene. So the real problem here is that the unexercised powers cannot be perceived. Maybe the exercise of power can be perceived, but the unexercised powers are purely counterfactual or inactual things, and for that reason they cannot be perceived. So I have given a premise, conclusion, formulation of this problem. One of the two opposing powers of an agent with leeway free will, one will always remain unactualized. What is inactual cannot have a proper causal correlation with our actual experience of power. But perceiving something X requires that our perceptual experience as of X be properly causally correlated with X. Therefore, there cannot be a perception of a two-way powers. Maybe there can be a perception of the one way that is exercised, but not of the other way that is not exercised. So, so Reid did have a solution to this problem. The problem is that his solution relies on a very heavy notion of causation, which entails that any causation is, for analytical reason, agent causation and free agent causation, to the effect that what we see as natural causation is in fact the actions, the direct actions of the divine agent, of the free divine agents, doing all things that happen in nature. So I think that most metaphysicians nowadays, even theist metaphysicians, would like to avoid this kind of commitment. And for that reason, I'm proposing another model. The other model I will propose, basically, just to put it shortly, the main intuition behind this model, in order to tackle the problem of perceiving the inactual, is that even if the exercise or the manifestation of an agent power remains inactual, a power has an emergent base, and the emergent base will be a categorical and actual property that the experience of power can be reliably connected to. So even if the experience cannot be related to the inactual manifestation, it can be reliably connected to the emergence base of the power itself. So this is really to put a long story very short. I'm just going, if I can take 3 more minutes, I'm just going to show how we can have, how we can satisfy the 2 constraints that I've presented before, the constraint of safety for the consequences of the experience, and the constraint of tracking for the proper content of the experience. So let's start with the easiest part, even though it may seem the hardest part. The easiest part is to give a reliable knowledge of indeterminism, causal indeterminism. So why is it in fact an easy thing to do? The reason why it's easy is because indeterminism is not, causal indeterminism is not the direct proper content of our experience of causal powers. It's a logical consequence of the experience of causal powers. And given that it's only a logical consequence of our experience, it doesn't have to be a tracking experience. It only has to be a safe experience. Now, is it the case that our belief in indeterminism is safe? Well, what it has to be in order to be safe, it has to be true in most or all nearby possible worlds. Now, I think it's fairly reasonable to assume that if we live in an indeterministic world, a world with indeterministic laws of nature, then the most nearby possible worlds will resemble our worlds with respect to this very fundamental fact about the laws of nature. So we can think that presumably, if we live in an indeterministic world, then most nearby possible worlds are indeterministic, and therefore our belief in indeterminism is safe. Safety is a rather easy thing to satisfy. Now, let's turn to the proper content. The proper content, for example, when Alice has the experience that I could tell the truth now, and the experience E2 that I could lie now. So she has these 2 experiences. How do these experiences track their content, their proper content, namely the presence of the power? Well, tracking means 2 conditions, counterfactual conditions. First, if Alice didn't have the power to tell the truth, she wouldn't have the experience E1. And second, if Alice did have the power to tell the truth in close counterfactual situations, Alice would still have the experience E1. I think it's fairly easy to satisfy the second conditional. Why so? Well, if you reflect on a rational agent, normally a rational agent is not going to try and do some things that he doesn't believe he can do. So it seems to be a necessary condition for rational agents to believe or to have the experience of ability in order to really have the ability. If the agent doesn't have the experience as of being able, he cannot have the real ability to do it. So given that this is the case, in the closest possible world in which Alice has the real ability to tell the truth, she will presumably, if she's still a rational agent, she will have the experience as of being able to tell the truth. So this is, I have summed up it as a condition. In normal rational agents, the configuration of the brain verifies the following property. The neural correlate of the experience as of being able to do A and the neural emergence base of the agent power to do A are correlated in such a way that if the agent had the power to do A in close counterfactual situations, then he would still have the experience as of being able to do A. And my response for the second conditional is in fact in the same ballpark. I'm assuming that it's also possible that for some certain brain configurations, the neural emergence base of the power and the neural correlate of the experience are so much connected that it's impossible to have the former without having the latter. So this I call lucid brain structures, because, well, there are brain structures in which you cannot have a power without being lucid about having it. So I just read very quickly this second condition. In normal lucid agents, the configuration of the brain verifies the following property: the neural correlate of the experiences of being able to do A and the neural emergence base of the agent power to do A are correlated in such a way that if the agent didn't have the power to do A, then he wouldn't have the experience as of being able to do A. I conclude with a very short remark. In this paper, I've tried to do two things. First thing, I have tried to convince the agent causalists, agent causal libertarians, that there is work to be done in order to provide an account of how our experience of agent causation could be reliable, and in an epistemic sense. It is not enough to just point out similarities with skeptical discussions. You have to give a positive model of reliability, and therefore of dependence, counterfactual or otherwise. Second, I have tried to provide such a model myself. And to be honest, I consider this second attempt as still very much tentative, and I'm much more interested in the success of the first task, which is to bring other agent causationists into my business of building substantive epistemological models. Thank you.